He holds the power there. He
Yeah.
can turn him.
And Joe's done with this nonsense. Or maybe,
Please.
or maybe
I
his
hate
internet
King
isn't the
Kong.
best.
I'm out.
That's weird. Okay. So we are continuing. So every now and then there's like one of those weeks when I managed to put together what the people who put together the traditional readings were up to. So last week we looked at the first John passage, which quoted from John 15. It was the one that talked about Christ's self-sacrifice being what is possible to give us the strength to do our own kind of living sacrifices. And then this week, they actually went back to look at the John passage. So I figured rather than mess it up, we'll look at this just neat, one of my all-time favorites. I think a lot of people feel this way. Out of John 15, Jesus reassuring the disciples as he is headed to the cross, and they are going to be very bewildered by the rest of the events of the evening, but he's praying to encourage them. In John 15, so I'll read 1-8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. He removes any of my branches that don't produce fruit, and he trims any branch that produces fruit, so it will produce even more fruit. You are already trimmed because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. A branch can't produce fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Likewise, you can't produce fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you will produce much fruit. Without me, you can't do anything. If you don't remain in me, you will be like a branch that is thrown out and dries. Those branches are gathered up, thrown into a fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified when you produce much fruit, and this is the way you prove that you are my disciples. So digging into this passage a little this week, I had something brought to my attention that I'm just dumb and had never noticed before. But when this image of I'm the vine is used, the image of a grapevine is actually one of the most common kind of prophetic Old Testament ones. Isaiah uses it like crazy. A couple of the other prophets do as well. The vine in the Old Testament is always Israel. So Israel, there's a bunch of these elaborate metaphors of Israel being referred to as a vine. And one of the things that's real common in kind of these extended metaphors about Israel, the nation, the family of God, being a grapevine is they talk about the Exodus a lot of the time, right? Like God took them as a wild grapevine or somewhere that was not ideal and transplanted them to the ideal situation. Sometimes he really goes into the elaborate, he digs it out and there's water, and he really puts them from a place that was hard and not good for them to be growing in, and makes the situation one in which they have the option of thriving, right? The vine is in the perfect conditions to thrive. And then almost every time this is mentioned in the Old Testament, there's another complaint on God's part. He says, look, I made the conditions just right for you guys to thrive and produce fruit, and you didn't. And it's almost always a negative productive a negative judgment, just saying, like, what else do I have to do for you? I've got you guys in the right spot. I've given you all this care and attention. Was it too much to ask for fruit from you? And I think the way that Jesus takes this long tradition of saying God expects fruit from those he blesses, God is expecting something good. I think in the Old Testament, you can read it as, the law. Maybe if they had just tried a little harder, or I do think that there's in all those passages, if you just trusted me and let me do the work, rather than you trying to do the work, that fruit would have been produced. But Jesus is claiming for himself in this point, not just this great metaphor of him being kind of the source and us the branches, but also like this long story of God being brokenhearted with his people, right? Of doing everything in the world for them, and not seeing that spiritual fruit that should have been the natural result of God's work. This long kind of ache on God's part of these blessings being squandered and being stolen for themselves is coming to an end. This is the end of that story, because in Jesus, in the Son, God is finding that kind of fulfillment, that dream, that original part of the plan of restoration coming true, right? And interestingly, of course, as Jesus expands this metaphor, it's not just a vine and a branches is one big thing, right? Israel, okay, is now the church or is now me. He says, no, I'm the vine itself. I'm the one connected to the soil. I'm the one who's doing all the real work. And where's the fruit coming from? It's coming through all of you. And so one of the kind of crazy things about this passage was this frustration that God has experienced in not seeing spiritual fruit from the people who are supposed to know and love him best, right? It's coming to an end. There's this kind of almost end of the world, things being made right element to this story. So it's in me, I am going to be producing the fruit. I'm going to be producing the things that God has expected and hoped for and dreamed of all along. And the conduit that I'm going to do all this beautiful work through is all of you. And just to make sure that this crazy claim doesn't go to anyone's head, we're going to dig into this metaphor a little bit more, right? With that kind of warning that traditionally God's people have not tended to produce the fruit that they are capable of. Why? Because we don't abide, because we don't trust the conditions God has put us in. We don't tend to do that. We miss out on this opportunity, not that we are supposed to be doing, but on, I think, remaining and connecting to Jesus so he can do all the work. So as I was kind of looking at this passage, I feel like there's kind of two main jobs that we as the branches, as all disciples, including those as we're going told to, have in this story. One's kind of positive, one's kind of negative. One is abiding or remaining, connecting with the vine itself. And I think the other one is a little scarier, but also important, and that's submitting ourselves to the pruning, right? I mean, in a real vine, they don't really have much say in it either way. They're either connected or they're not, but we get some autonomy, we get some choice. Do we connect with Jesus? Do we submit to God's pruning? So I thought I'd go with the pruning one first, so we can get the less fun one out of the way and go back to the abiding, remaining at the end. So just kind of random thoughts I had on this metaphor. Again, you guys, as always, are much smarter and more spiritual than me, so feel free to break in and improve on my metaphors. But one of the things I was reading this week is naturally vines, and particularly grapevines, which is likely what Jesus had in mind here, their natural preference is to produce lots and lots of really second-rate grapes. So they would prefer to spread out, they would prefer to cover as much ground as they can, and they would prefer to put basically as little energy into lots and lots of grapes. Grapevines apparently prefer to be kind of shallow and spread thin and not really do the real work of producing a good quality grape, right? Interesting, I think, kind of metaphor in that. And so what is the solution? How do we, or how does, a vine dresser actually get the best out of a vine? Well, of course, it is pruning. It's cutting it back down to get a few very high quality grapes that are good use, have good flavors, all the knowledge that's out there in vine dressing largely comes down to how to force these plants to produce their absolute best, to get the absolute best out of them. It's not what they naturally want to do, but it's what they're capable of. You can obviously see a few metaphors there for connecting our own spiritual lives with what God is wanting to do. Again, I think submitting to this knife, to what God knows we are capable of, I think it takes the letting go of sometimes of our dreams, sometimes of our ambitions, sometimes of our self-images. It's not always a fun thing by any means, especially in a culture that kind of tells us you can be whatever you want, you should do whatever you want, right? I like that message personally. I just wish it was true. It's not. And God, again, in his goodness, does ask us to let go sometimes, for him to cut off some things that we're really attached to. But I really liked the comment I read this week in pointing out that there's a special knowledge and attention that comes, there's a special intimacy that comes when a vine dresser is cutting the vine, right, or a branch. The vine dresser has to really know that branch well, know where in the past it's produced its best, which parts are growing out that may look like good new growth, may look like something really promising, but the vine dresser knows its best work is in this direction. It knows that this is the best way to get the best growth out of it, because the vine dresser wants the long-term health, productivity, and vitality out of these branches. It knows and believes in the branches a lot more than the branches themselves do at times. They're always spouting off new growth, thinking in this direction, this is what I could be doing, this is what I could be producing. And the vine dresser, the smart vine dresser, knows them well enough to know where they are going to be at their best and to cut off all that extra stuff. Just kind of another warning I thought of this week is producing fruit isn't a defense against future cutting and future pruning, right? You kind of feel like, okay, no, I produced some fruit. I did something good. Now leave me alone. I'm here. I'm happy, right? The better fruit a branch is producing, the more of an invitation it is inviting for this special attention. And so we say like, okay, that's good enough for me. But for the vine dresser, for God, that's not good enough. The better fruit we are producing, God is going to be able to amplify that and bring even better and better and better and better work out of it. And I just see this like some of the best coaches I ever had in sports, right? I was really happy with my performance sometimes. And they looked at me and said, "No, you're capable of even better than that." And you're like, "Okay, fine." Well, and they push me and really make you sweat, and they'd get you to that point. All right, thank you so much for pushing me. That's awesome. But I actually think you're better than this. Like, no, stop, leave me alone, right? At some point, I want to just cruise. The vine dresser sees what we are capable of, believes in us way more than we believe in ourselves most of the time. And so that cutting will continue to make us better and better and stronger and produce better and better fruit. That is kind of the promise that's a little scary here of submitting ourselves to that pruning. But I also think there's a real beauty in having the God of the universe say, we are the expression of his love, of that fruit that he's been dreaming of since the world fell apart. He takes branches like all of us, and he's producing that fruit that he's been dreaming of all this time. The more positive one is this remaining, this abiding, being connected to the vine itself. I think it's important to point out in this phrase or in this section that, okay, what are we talking about ultimately? What shows health and strength is the fruit, right? That's how you can actually tell. At no point in this passage are we told to produce fruit. It's not about trying. It is not about producing fruit. We are told to remain or abide. Be connected, and you will produce fruit. It's not on us to produce this fruit. It's not on us to, frankly, judge the quality of the fruit we are producing when we are connected, right? And that's really hard to do. It's hard to be faithful and do things and say, is there a result here? Is this going anywhere? Do I feel totally stuck because there's something wrong with me, because I'm doing something wrong, because I'm not spiritually awake enough, or whatever it is? The answer is no. You remain. You stay connected to the vine, the source, and that's going to naturally happen. That is going to flow through you. I was interested that this word abide or remain kind of has two kind of roots. And one is almost stubbornness. Sometimes you see perseverance, steadfastness, faithfulness. Like the image there is like clinging. Like, again, if the branch could detach itself in some way, it is just sticking on. It says, this is the thing I'm supposed to be part of. And so I'm just hanging on, whether I see it or whether I understand it or not. And the other one is like an openness or receptivity. The image in some ways is like a cup or a bowl or something that's open and willing to be filled. So you can kind of see those. We're clinging to the vine. we're remaining, we're abiding. I'm saying, no, this is where I'm going to get my source of strength. And whatever Jesus decides to do, we are open to it. We are open to being filled and poured into. We're not saying, no, I'm full, I've had enough, I'm done. Like, if this is what you say needs to happen, I'm open to it. And I think that goes into kind of our discernment and things as well, right? We need to be listening well. We need to be filled well. We need to be just tenacity, showing tenacity and hanging on well. The passage talks about kind of looking for level of connection. How do we actually know if we're connected to Jesus or not? And they point towards fruit, not trying hard, not producing fruit, but if there is fruit, if others can see it, if sometimes we can see it, there are spiritual things going on in our lives, we can say, okay, maybe we are connected, maybe we're not. And if there are times when we're like, I'm not so sure, Lord, I would argue that doesn't necessarily mean we are not connected, that we are not producing fruit, but it may mean we need to listen and be open to seeing it or hearing or trusting that I'm going to cling on. I don't get it right now. I don't see it. Is it because I'm not holding on? Maybe. I need help with that. Is it because I don't have the perspective? Maybe. I'm going to cling on and remain open to you. And so I think that just remaining and staying connected to the vine is kind of what we're supposed to do here. It's not assess what's going well and what isn't. It's not try harder to do those Christian-y things we know we're supposed to. He says, abide, hold on to me, remain open to me, and cling. Hold on to the actual source of our strength here. And I think the other thing we tend to ignore, because I bet all of us, myself included, as we read this, we tend to think about, okay, me and Jesus, how does this affect my spiritual life? That's still a pretty modern Western spin on it. The original audience, and for most of human history and a good chunk of the world today, would have been asking, okay, are we producing fruit? Are we remaining? Because it's not ultimately about clinging to God, not connecting with God on our own. That's why we do this. We're here together. It's a communal thing. There may be days and times when we need to lift one another up, to remain open as a group. There may be times when we hold each other's hands onto that vine, if again we're using that clinging metaphor. It was never assumed until recently in the Christian church we were supposed to do this thing by ourselves. Yeah, there's been a handful of kind of exceptional people who found themselves in situations where they were alone and God was enough for them. But that was never meant to be the ideal. It's still not the ideal. So wherever we feel like we are on that abiding, that producing fruit, the question is, how are we supporting one another in that? How are we reminding ourselves that we are people who abide and people who remain? And so to kind of end, I just had a few reflection questions for us. What is the spiritual fruit Christ is growing in our lives right now? Can we articulate it? We're not so sure. What spiritual fruit is Christ growing in our lives right now? What extra growth have we maybe shot out the last year, the last few months, that might need some pruning? Are we going to submit if those things need to go? Because God expects some better fruit from us, knows we are capable of better fruit. And how open, receptive.
We've all had to learn more patience in the last year. I mean, maybe COVID is pruning us a little bit about going forward at 90 miles an hour.
Last question was just how open and receptive do you feel like we are to that life-giving vine? And so the kind of just last thought I had, I was thinking of this kind of that Deuteronomy, there's that great choices. There are two paths in front of you. One leads to life, one leads to death. And so I think we can either choose life, which is remaining and submitting to pruning, or we can choose death, choosing to go it alone, did it my way, which leads to withering in this metaphor, right? So I just ask us all in those questions. What will we choose? Life or death? Fruit, which may require some pruning, some abiding, but life and fruit. Any other thoughts? Any stirrings? No, I did it my own way. So I don't who it's
Sinatra.
it's a Sinatra song, right? It's the number one chosen funeral song in America, by the way.
Oh,
It is played at more funerals than any other song. More
weird.
than Amazing Grace. I did it my own way. The Frank Sinatra song. Yeah.
Terrible.